Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Meleagrou-Hitchens. I'm the director of the program on Extremism, and I'm extremely happy to have this event today, which has been it's the end result of a lot of work that we did internally on an issue that is very dear to us. So this is the finally the day that a big project sees the light. First of all, we're very happy to see Alex Radicalization back. Alex was the head of research at the program until last summer. He's now back in London, but still fully involved in the center. And he's the author of the report we're launching today on Salafism in America. It's a very extensive report. I think we just put it live on the website, so you can download it. It's some 200 pages, so quite a read. And it's really the product of 2 years of research, which Alice led, but I have to say it was a collective product. Of course, he's the main author, but several people at the office worked on it. Moussa was also very involved in the research, at least when he was still working at the center, and several other researchers at the center worked on it, and I want to acknowledge them for this work. It's something that we started 2 years ago. Keep in mind that the program itself is 3.5 years old. So we've not been, we always thought from the beginning that it was very interesting to study the relationship between ideas and actions when it comes to extremism. Understanding, and this applies to all ideologies, understanding whether certain concepts drive certain actions. And we're very aware that when it comes to Salafism, there's a very intense debate taking place in many Western countries. I would say, particularly in European countries, in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany. The issue of Salafism is very much at the fore of the political debate, with obviously different arguments being made, both that would connect Salafism with violence, with jihadism, seeing what I guess the term that was used for a long time was the term conveyor belt, seeing Salafism as sort of a conveyor belt for political violence. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, those that do not see any correlation between Salafism and violence. It is obviously a very complex topic, starting with the fact that Salafism itself is very complex. It's a movement that is very heterogeneous. And we thought that if that debate is taking place in Europe at the highest levels of policymaking circles, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the academic circles, we didn't see it taking place with the same intensity, with the same nuance here in the United States. Even though, and I don't want to give away too much of what Alice will be talking about, we do see a fairly large Salafist community also here in the United States, one that dates, at least traces its origins back a few decades, and one that sees quite a large number of followers. That is, Salafists of all kinds, from those engaged simply in those adopt a conservative interpretation of the religion, to the few that actually engage in violence. But it is a milieu that does exist in the United States. It has a presence and has been severely understudied, and has been, for the most part, absent from public debates. So we thought that we would try humbly to fill that gap, or at least start a debate on that topic, and we found doing it in the way that we try to tackle these issues, which is through a lot of research, through a lot of field work, through going through documents, interviewing people, and so on and so forth. So the way we're going to have the debate today is that Alex will present the findings of this report, which, as I said, is live now. Feel free to retweet it, post it, send it. And then we have two perfect discussants to kick off the conversation. Right after Alex, I'm very happy to see Meleagrou-Hitchens, who has been one of the most prominent voices when it comes to the study of Salafism in Europe, in particular in France. He has written extensively about it. He's written a deep book about Salafism in Europe. So there's no better speaker to really see what the European angle on that is. And lastly, our latest addition to the team, which you all know, Hassan, who's now a senior fellow with us, has been doing terrific work on issues related to Salafism and Islamism, with a focus more on the Middle East. So again, that's probably very useful to see how these debates shape up in the Middle East. So without further ado, and of course after that we open it to questions. So Alex, without further ado.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Thank you for coming. I think probably best to begin briefly, at least, with a quick description or discussion of what Salafism is or how it's understood. Comes from the term Salaf al-Saleh, which describes the first three generations of Muslims, so Muhammad and his followers, and the two generations after them. The Salafi movement essentially believes that these first three generations represent the purest form of Islam in their beliefs, in their practices, and as well in their outward appearance. The goal of any Salafi, essentially, I'll project my voice instead, I think, just to avoid that. The goal of any Salafi is to essentially purify Islam that they believe has been corrupted since those first three generations, particularly through application of the doctrine of Tawheed, or the belief in the oneness of God as the sole deity worthy of worship, and all of this being based on a literal reading of the primary Islamic text, the Quran and Hadith. So a lot of the kind of the purification revolves around removing innovations that they believe have creeped into Islam over the centuries, particularly spiritualism, Sufism in particular. Also the influence of kind of ancient Greek philosophy, reason, logic, and the application of those to religious belief is seen by Salafis as a fundamental questioning of the Word of God, and therefore sinful, and also particularly fighting against different forms of what they see as this idol worship or shirk. Essentially, they ask that their followers don't view, or that Islam should not be viewed through any sort of filter. As such, they therefore reject generally the four schools of Sunni jurisprudence, or fiqh, and they prefer a process of independent reasoning, or ijtihad, as they describe it, the Arabic word for it. When you put all that together, you kind of can start understanding the appeal of this movement. It has a kind of liberating and empowering sense to it. It transcends culture, race, religion, culture, race, and nationality, and it presents this kind of pristine, pure form of Islam that anyone can access. They don't need to be told by elites, as they see it, or religious scholars about how to understand their faith. They can go do it themselves. And in a way, anyone who's heard discussions about so-called populism, mostly applied to the right, we can actually think of Salafism as having a sort of populist appeal. It makes Islam available to the people, cutting through the middleman and the elite, who are the kind of gatekeepers. And that can be very appealing for a lot of followers. Takes away the control of this kind of scholarly elite, empowers followers to find out the religion for themselves by accessing the primary texts. And I think that's sort of as simple as I'm going to keep it on describing Salafism. And just before we get into the American iteration of the movement, probably useful also break it down into kind of three, I suppose, widely accepted categories. Though there are problems around them. I know we can maybe talk about that later. But essentially, there are three different movements within Salafism that employ different means to achieve the goals of the movement. In Western scholarship, they're divided between quietists, purists. These are Salafis, mostly the foundational Salafi figures, Sheikh Albani and others, who pretty much say the only way to implement, or the only legitimate methodology to implement our goals is through processes of studying, tarbiyah, and dawah, so proselytizing, education, on the ground, grassroots education and outreach. They are very against, generally, any sort of political participation. They believe that involvement in politics can itself be an innovation in Islam. They believe that it also encourages the dividing or division of the religion because of the creation of political parties, and can cause tensions or fitna. Probably the most popular form of Salafism today is the second strand, which is what we can call the activist or the politicos, which describes them as. Essentially, same creed, same belief in Tawheed, and similar goals, but quite different method. The belief in the inherent legitimacy of political activism to achieve goals. So, be that through protests, creation of political parties, active contesting or contestation of the state through political activism. The key thing to keep in mind, what really differentiates them from the Quietists, is that they have pretty much fused their theology, as I've just described it, with Islamist ideology. In particular, they've taken on the belief that when you talk about Tawheed and the centrality of worshiping God as the only deity, they also believe that God is therefore the only lawmaker, the sole sovereign over the affairs of humankind. So any laws that dictate human affairs should come directly from God. This is considered by Quietists to be an innovation in and of itself, and quite a dangerous one in their view. And that's pretty much the biggest contribution, or the biggest difference, I would say. And finally, we have probably the category that's most well known here, which is the Salafi-jihadist. Essentially, some describe them as radicalized activists, individuals who have decided that political activism alone is not effective or even a legitimate form or a legitimate method. Essentially, the belief that jihad or violent activism through either insurgency or terrorism is the only legitimate method to achieve the goals of the movement. Now, of course, there's a huge amount more to discuss when we talk about these different categories, but it's important to keep them in mind when we move to the question of how this movement has manifested itself in the U.S. and why. And generally, we can break down the Salafi movement in America in these three categories: Quietist, activist, and jihadis. Turning our attention then to the U.S., from what I've been able to find out over the last couple of years through interviews and accessing various documents, is that often the assumption is that Salafism came to America because of Saudi Arabian funneling of money and sending of preachers to the United States. Of course, that's a big part of the story, but actually it appears that Salafism first made its initial forays into the U.S. through an individual called Muhammad Sayyid Adli, who we can talk about a bit later. Himself doesn't accept the term Salafi being imposed on him, and we can talk about why a lot of Salafis don't like being called this. But anyhow, he was an Egyptian, or is an Egyptian, who studied for many years in Saudi Arabia and came to the United States in the mid-'70s at the request of a female American convert who came to Saudi Arabia to make Hajj and also find a preacher that she thought she could bring back to the U.S. and help purify the Islam that existed there, which was heavily influenced by movements like the Nation of Islam in particular, who Salafis see as essentially heretics. So he comes to the U.S., comes to New York, sets up a mosque, and over the years gets involved with a lot of confrontations with pre-existing Islamic movements in the U.S. So he's an interesting figure who we profile in the report, actually, and if you really want to get down to the details, you can check that out near the beginning of the study. Other crucial developments, though, when we start talking about the involvement of Saudi Arabia, 1988, establishment of an organization called the Institute of Islamic and Arabic Sciences, IIASA. This was essentially a satellite of the Imam Ibn Saud University in Riyadh. It offered courses for American converts to study and become accredited at that university, and ideally actually go to Saudi Arabia and train with the leading Saudi scholars. It was eventually shut down in 2005 due to beliefs that it was spreading extremist ideology. So all of this helped the growth of the first really quietist. The original version of Salafism here was a quietist one. And it was an organization called the Quran and Sunnah Society, QSS, that was set up officially in the mid-'90s, but had been operating throughout the '80s. And this was organized by an individual called Mohammed Jabril, who was himself a student of al-Albani, who was a crucial figure in the quietist movement. Essentially, this operated originally as a way to cater to the needs of Gulf students in the United States, particularly in the East and West coasts. But eventually, he found a pretty willing audience of American Muslim converts, in particular among African-American communities in the East Coast who had converted to Islam through organizations like Nation of Islam and others, who had converted to Islam and had become part of this movement that essentially saw Islam as a vehicle for protest for black communities that had felt downtrodden and rejected by their society, a particular white American Christian society. They saw Islam as the perfect alternative. So there was already a base of people who had engaged with Islam when QSS and the Salafis started really reaching out. And they were able to convince a lot of these guys to convert to Salafism and take on this pure version of Islam that didn't have the baggage of American history and society and race relations along with it. Essentially, it operated as a conference circuit. It would go around various communities it was targeting and would have talks given by Saudi sheikhs. It would have talks given by Salafis who had moved to the United States and by some of these new converts who had begun to, through the IISA, study, and some of them had actually gone to Medina, studied for 7 years at the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia, and come back and had this, some of the first American-born Salafis kind of emerge in this circuit. And, Saudi Arabia certainly saw in this community of people who were interested in Salafism an opportunity to reach out to a group of people who were disillusioned with America, right in the heart of the secular West, and this opportunity to gain a following in a place that perhaps seemed unattainable before. Eventually, by the kind of mid-90s, late 90s, QSS began to collapse for a number of reasons. A lot of infighting, really based around maintaining the purity of the faith. So there was no, QSS really took its entire sort of direction from the Saudi establishment, quietist sheikhs, unquestioning support for their teachings and spread of their teachings, no discussion, no debate, and certainly no dissent. And this kind of cult-like atmosphere began to take shape. One former member just said to me that their attitude was either it's all good or it's no good. And the idea there being, unless you agree with every single thing that the sheikhs were teaching, you were essentially not excommunicated, but you were considered to be an innovator. And as a result, this movement essentially imploded because of all this infighting. And one of the other things that it failed to do because of the quietist influence was it did not engage with politics at all. Didn't engage with the world around it. And it encouraged followers to separate themselves from all these day-to-day discussions of politics that were seen as kind of cheap and a waste of time and diverting attention from important study of creed. So this opened up the opportunity for activist Salafis to fill this void, and they were essentially set up through this organization called the Islamic Assembly of North America, IANA, set up by an Islamist activist called Bassam Kifagi, and offered, this pure Islam. The creed was all essentially the same, but a much wider engagement with geopolitics, especially related to the global Muslim community of the Ummah, and offering practical solutions to the problems that were being seen, both in conflict zones around the world, Chechnya and Bosnia at a particular time, and domestically to some extent. So IANA operated very similar to QSS, speaker circuits, events, things like this. It was set up in Dearborn, Michigan. But after 9/11, huge amount of attention was turned to IANA by the FBI, and effectively it shut down by the mid-2000s because it was seen as becoming a repository for extremist thought as well. In particular, at the time, it was reproducing and spreading the teachings of a key activist Salafi in Saudi Arabia called Salam al-Auda, who at the time was advocating, it's walked back on some of this now, but was advocating things like suicide bombing and involvement in jihad. So you had these two strands emerge and collapse. quietists and activists. And there were two kind of outcomes, particularly from the activist iteration. One was a sort of new American Salafism that has emerged that is very prevalent today. Arguably the most influential Islamic group in the country today is a place called the Meleagrou-Hitchens Institute, run by a very well-known sheikh called Yasser Qadi, himself a former quietist involved with QSS, educated in Saudi Arabia, took on some elements of activist Salafism. And people, as IANA collapsed, people like Qadi set up organizations like Al-Maghrib that have kind of shed a lot of the acrimonious elements of Salafism. They're not too preoccupied with sticking very close to the Saudi sheikhs. Yes, most of their teaching still is rooted in the key Saudi scholars' teachings, but they present this kind of very Americanized version of activist conservative Islam. They engage with social justice issues. They're very critical of U.S. foreign policy as it relates to Muslims. They organize or they discuss issues like the Dreamers Act and the so-called travel ban or so-called Muslim ban. They engage a lot with American society and politics, and they've kind of created this sort of what you can call American post-Salafism. Still quite conservative, taking their lead from the teachings of the Saudi sheikhs, but really being heavily influenced by the fact they've grown up in the United States. And they accept things like scientific inquiry, belief in evolution, things like this are able to be discussed in ways that Salafis mostly simply could not. But there was another offshoot kind of movement from this activism, and that was the Salafi-jihadist. So how people decided to express this activism really depended on how they saw the world. And the first Salafi-jihadis really emerged from the IANA strand as well, particularly a scholar or sheikh who is today in prison in the U.S., a man called Ali al-Tamimi, a very influential figure in IANA, began his career as a kind of activist sheikh, very, very popular in Northern Virginia, was the first really American-born Salafi scholar to engage with politics, gained a huge following in the early and mid-90s, and set up an organization called the al-Qaeda Islamic Center, and his work was disseminated far and wide through CD, audio, and on the internet. And before 9/11, he was quite a vocal activist Salafi. Didn't really discuss jihad very much. Certainly engaged with political issues of the day, was critical of secular Western democracy, but did so through the framework of nonviolent activism and discussion. After 9/11, quite quickly he changed his view of the world. He decided that that event essentially had split the world into between essentially Islam and the rest. And he told a very close group of his followers shortly after 9/11 that they were going to have to pick a side. A major war was coming, one that was going to be essentially the run-up to the apocalypse, as in fact IS see things today. He had a pretty similar view, influenced a lot by activist Salafi sheikhs in Saudi Arabia, and essentially told his followers they're going to have to pick a side and fight against what will be a major American move on Islam, as he saw, and particularly discussions about invading Afghanistan at that time were coming to fruition. And long story short, around 12 of these followers came together to form what was coined as what was dubbed the Virginia Jihad Network, and some of which actually went to train with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan with the plan to go and join the Taliban. All under the instruction of Ali al-Tamimi. I spoke to a number of members of that network and former people who knew him, and they described pretty clearly how important he was in helping them make these decisions. The question there being really this move from activist to jihadi, how does it happen? Is it when you adopt this form of activist Salafism, are you more subject to changing your methodology based on the shifts in geopolitics? If things change, you might change your mind on fighting jihad. This is essentially what happened with Ali al-Tamimi. He's still in jail today. His conviction was around a conspiracy to provide support for the Taliban, among other things. He's strongly appealing his conviction, and he's got a decent shot, I think, of getting out based on a pretty complex legal reasons. it's funny enough, he was offered a plea deal to go for he would have served 14 years. He refused it out of principle, knowing he'd be convicted for a life sentence. It shows you the devotion and belief that he has. So really, to me, he represents the first real Salafi-jihadi in the U.S., the American-born. But not, I wouldn't call him a global jihadist. What do I mean there? His idea of jihad was foreign conflicts involving Muslims being oppressed by occupiers, the involvement in some sort of jihadist insurgencies, not, on the other hand, like the global jihadists would say, responding to global indiscriminate terrorism. Arguably the first American global jihadist was Anwar al-Awlaki, who probably a figure most of you are more aware of, pretty close or friends with Ali al-Tamimi. Interestingly, not that involved with any of these Salafi movements I've just described to you. He's considered, particularly by Salafis, to be much more a product of Islamist ideology and activism. His involvement with organizations like the Dar al-Hijra Mosque, Falls Church, the Islamic Society of North America organizations thought to be more influenced by Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, Islamist thinking rather than Salafi. But anyhow, I do think al-Awlaki does represent a version of Salafi jihadism. Again, began with encouraging Muslims to be activists, to fight back against what he saw as the war on Islam under the guise of the war on terror after 9/11, and eventually himself deciding, again, that activism was not enough. Jihad was the only solution to deal with this growing and multifaceted war on Islam. This is his own claim as well that he made later on. And essentially left the United States to eventually join al-Qaeda in the Peninsula. Today, just to wrap it up, we have a couple of Salafi jihadi preachers working in the United States today. I should say that they've not committed any crimes. They've not been convicted of any terrorist offenses. But they are fairly vocal. The most popular, an imam called Ahmed Moussa Jabril, some of you may have heard of him, came to prominence during the beginnings of the Syrian civil war and the emergence of IS as a figure who was very influential for Americans and other Westerners deciding to go join and fight for IS. He'd been operating in the U.S. for many years in the 90s in Dearborn, Michigan, had got a huge local following of students at local chapters of the Muslim Students Association and universities like Dearborn and others around there, and had quite a large following. And in the report, you'll see a breakdown of exactly his activities at that time and how he used early Yahoo message boards actually to create a community of followers on his website. Pretty vocal supporter of jihad against the Islamic State, jihad against America early on here in the 90s and early 2000s. Went to jail for quite a few years, between 2005 and 2012, for offenses not related to terrorism. While in prison, became pretty influential in the Terre Haute facility in Indiana. Became essentially the leader of the Muslim prisoners there. Became quite close with John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban. This is both, we found this out both through claims made by Jabril himself, by a couple of prisoners, and also we spoke to people in the U.S. prison authorities who confirmed that he had this influence there. Since he left, again, always using the internet very effectively, presents himself as really this scholar figure, talks about all the issues that Salafi scholars are concerned with, creed and methodology, but every so often he falls into discussions about what to do about the suffering of Muslims, particularly in Syria, and he's very clear that the only solution is the establishment of an Islamic State there through violence. Again, I've not seen him discuss or support terrorism in the United States or in Europe, although he has been linked and is an inspiration for a number of well-known attacks, including the London Bridge stabbings, and particularly Quran Butt, the Brit who was involved with that, was said to have been a close follower of his. But his main discussions revolve around the legitimacy of fighting jihad in Syria when he broaches the topic. But if you check him out on YouTube, you won't immediately know that that's what we're talking about. And that's actually one of the problems, arguably, is that he's very effective at presenting himself as this legitimate scholar figure. Appears to know what he's talking about when he talks about theology, and certainly for people who are doing their research online, could be pretty easily sucked into what he's talking about, and then eventually hear him start discussing current events, where we realize actually he's definitely in the Salafi-jihadi spectrum. I guess I'll just end by saying, guys like this are difficult to deal with because they can quite effectively skirt the line legally. They can say everything they really need to say to encourage fighting jihad without breaking the law. They can use heavily coded religious language. And it's very difficult, really, in places where we have codified free speech to do much about it until they almost inevitably cross the line. Though, I should say, Jabril has not done that. He has been muzzled a little bit online. I know he was not allowed to use the internet for a while. I think he's back on now a little bit. But I will leave it at that. Thanks again.
Great. Great. Thank you, Alex. I have to say, a remarkable achievement in condensing a 200-page report in a very short but yet comprehensive talk. And again, I really encourage you to go see and read the report. It's very meticulous. It's basically a book, not just in the size of it, but in the way it's researched, in the footnotes, and what a solid body of scholarly work that is. So thanks again, Alex. I think one issue that you didn't touch upon, it would be my first question to you once we finish this, is why the issue has not been very debated in the U.S. It's somewhat absent from the policymaking debate in the U.S. Well, as we said, it is very much debated in Europe. So probably I'll ask Mohammed, who was very kind also in being one of the reviewers of the report and giving us the feedback. I'll ask him, first of all, to look at the similarities and differences between the American and the Europeans. Again, saying European is a very unsophisticated way of looking at every country as its own scene. And also telling us a bit why the issue is so debated in Europe, why it's so important.
Okay, but first of all, good morning to all of you. Thank you, Lorenzo, for having me here once again. Last time it was about the Muslim Brotherhood. And I mean, Salafism, Jihadism, and Muslim Brotherhood you are fond of these topics, I know that. So it's always a pleasure. Thanks to my colleagues. It's indeed a very good report. And especially not only a very good report, but a new type of work, because you're right. I mean, compared to Europe, for example, I have started working on Salafism in 2004. So let's say almost 15 years ago. I think there is several factors. The first one has to do with history, because we have the huge Muslim presence in countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, of course. I'm not talking about Russia. Russia is also very important. You will find there a very important Muslim community. There's countries like Spain and Italy that have been for years and even decades, countries of immigration. Now they are becoming countries of immigration. For example, if you're aware of what's going on today in the area of Barcelona and Spain, we have a huge discussion on, does Salafism lead to jihadism? That's a very, very burning issue. I'm going to elaborate more on that. So first of all, history. Then you have also a matter of numbers, a matter of demographics. Because, for example, if you look at France today, 67 million people, and we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and some people would say even up to 7 million. 7 million Muslims in France today. So imagine, compared to the United States, which is 340 million people, we have 3 or 4 million Muslims. So you see the difference. It's like if we had here in the US, we had 20 or 25 million Muslims. So, of course, history, once again, demographics, and politics and geography, because we are very close to North Africa. We are very close to the Middle East. For example, it's a bit different. I mean, it's not directly connected to the issue of Salafism and Jihadism. Some people would say it is, but when we have, for example, a war in the Gaza Strip, we have people fighting in the streets in Paris. I don't know if you are aware of that, but every 2, 3, 4, 5 years now, every time we have an assault over Gaza, we have people, Muslims and Jews, especially in the young generations, fighting each other. In some areas in Paris or in the areas of around some big cities in France. So I think that's why we have two different levels of. I would put it this way: the U.S. is going through what France, Belgium, to some extent Germany, these countries, what they have started going through in the late, let's say, 90s. In France, actually, it's, I would say, the early 90s. Because there is a French specificity which is connected not to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a lot to say in terms of Salafism, obviously also in terms of jihadism. But when it comes to France, we also are very connected to Algeria. And what happened in Algeria in the 90s was extremely important to understand why we had some imams, some Islamic scholars, leaving Algeria and going to France in order, to separate themselves from what was happening at that time in Algeria. But that's another factor of why Salafism is so important, because it's not only connected to the Gulf. The Gulf is extremely important. It's paramount, of course, but we have all other countries like Algeria that played a huge role in the expansion, in the globalization of Salafism towards many countries in Europe and starting with France. Let me also tell you a bit about history in the longer term. So we know, for example, it's always complicated to define Salafism, and I agree with Alex, because, are we talking about a branch, a very specific and very really well-established ideology? Is it a school? Is it a philosophy? It's very complicated. The idea maybe is to draw some comparisons from other religions. Let me give you an example. Here in the US, we are a very multicultural, multi-religious society, of course, but we are impacted historically. You are. Sorry, I'm here just a guest here, but the US society has been extremely impacted, by the Protestant, reflection. What happened, for example, in Europe, during the Renaissance? We have an Italian here, so I can ask him about. For example, how do you understand, how do you explain the emergence of Protestantism, in Europe, let's say, ever since the 15th and 16th century? What happened? Actually, of course, it's connected to several factors, but we have a key question, a founding question, which is that when do Christians start becoming less Christians? When? For example, if you are Martin Luther, in 1512, 1513, 1515, and you are in Roma, you are in the Vatican City, and you are witnessing what happened, with some popes who were at first sight Christians, good Christians, but in private, or some people would say in the public sphere, they had started doing some things, committed some things, like, for example, telling you, if you give me enough money, I'm going to give you a place in heaven. Is it about the real, authentic, genuine Christian faith? Martin Luther said, hey, come on, guys, we are doing something extremely wrong. We have to go back to our scriptures, and we have to find the real way of being today a real Christian. He made a protest. He protested, actually, facing the Catholic Church at that time. I'm not saying it's exactly the same in Islam, but we can draw some comparisons. I'll give you an example. What's happening when some people start to say that Quran is not the real word of God? Are we facing a real crisis in the Islamic faith? So some people, they started to say, we have to go back to the faith of the Salaf that Alex told you about. The real way, the purest way of being a Muslim, so that's why we say that Salafism is a kind of revivalism, or, I don't know if you are aware of what's happening with the Mormons, the idea of restoring the first version of Islam. With the Mormons, it's the first version of the church, but we are talking here about the Islamic faith. That's a key question. When do you start to become, let's say, not a real Muslim? You're not a real Muslim anymore. So that's, for example, what generated a huge crisis in the history of Islam in the 8th century, the Christian 8th century. People like Ahmed ibn Hanbal said, hey guys, we are going too far. We need to go back to the very first version of Islam, which is the Salaf version. You have another crisis, a few centuries afterwards. We had some people like, I don't know if you heard of somebody like a very, very, very important Islamic scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, 12th century, 13th century, starting to say to some people, for example, some Islamic leaders converting to Islam. At that time, it was no longer the Abbasid Empire. It was about some Mongols leaders, some Turkish leaders, starting to say, okay, we are going to convert to Islam in order to rule over an Islamic society. But we are still, we are going to continue being in touch with our first, let's say, for example, legal prescriptions, let's say the Mongol prescriptions, the Turkish prescriptions. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, hey, no, I'm going to be the warden of the true Islam, and I'm going to tell you, you are not Muslims. You are not real Muslims as long as they refer to these non- or un-Islamic, illegal prescriptions. And he made a fatwa, for example, to say, and it's very famous because you cannot understand the current Salafist and jihadist debates nowadays if you do not refer to Ibn Taymiyyah. Hey guys, you are going to judge, basing your judgment on a non-Islamic, reference. It means you are not Muslims anymore. I'm going to say that you are kuffar, that you are not Muslims anymore. So he made a takfir decision. He issued a fatwa. Fatwa refers to the decision an Islamic scholar can make. Because you have followed a non-Islamic legal prescription, I'm going to tell you you are not Muslims anymore. Imagine today what some people are doing with, I don't know, for example, the Saudi alliance with the United States. Because, for example, if you do not refer to a very well established and very well defined set of prescriptions, we are allowed, some people, Salafis, for example, jihadists, for example, they feel allowed to tell you that you are not a Muslim anymore. Now, a few centuries after that again, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the 18th century, have you ever heard of somebody whose name is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab? Wahhabism? What is Wahhabism? It's a very specific version of Salafism in a very specific place, Saudi Arabia. Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia came after that, in the 18th century, and this preacher, this Islamic scholar, this imam, started to say, what I am witnessing here all around me is not Islamic anymore. We have people, they refer to trees. I'm talking about trees in the nature. And they are going there and they are going to worship these trees because supposedly in the early years of Islam, the Prophet was used, to pray here, to pray, next to the tree. So it means this tree has become a symbol of, it deserves a very specific worship. It's not Islam anymore. So by generating a sort of alliance, a religious and political alliance with a very famous man, a tribal leader, Al-Saud, which is the ancestor of the Saud that we have today. He started, a new, a new type of expansion for the Salafist reference. Now let me go back, to the current period. It's true that we had, debates dealing with, how do we, first of all, define Salafism, and how do we separate, how do we implement a certain typology between the different branches, the different, ways of living today, Salafism. It's very complicated, because you have some people, that's true, they are going to say that the most depends on two questions, basically. What is your ultimate purpose, and what is the methodology, what's the word? What is your way in order to restore, the purity of Islam? First of all, has it to do with an Islamic State or an Islamic society? And it's extremely important because if you decide that it is about the state, you need to capture the state. So on the one hand, you can say that, for example, political participation is halal, is something which is recommended. For example, have you followed what happened in Egypt after the revolution or during the revolution? We had some people, some Salafis, they have never been, or at least that's what they said, they never paid attention to a sort of political activism, but they changed, they split it, they adopted a new way of defining Salafism by, engaging into the institutional political sphere. In this way, they were doing, have you ever heard of the Muslim Brotherhood? Let's say the historical Islamist player that has engaged in political activism almost 1 century before that. So we have with this specific understanding of Salafism, what I would call a new generation of political Islam. We have other people that say it's not useful. It doesn't, it's not useful, to commit yourself or to engage into the political sphere because it's like you are dealing with people who are never going to give up power. That's why violence, for example, is completely authorized. There is a very, very, very important expression and concept in the Salafist ideology, which is al-wala wal-bara. Have you ever heard of this expression that we can translate in English into loyalty and disavowal? If, let's say, I am assuming that I am a Salafist, my ideology is Salafism, who do I need to obey? And who do I need, to disobey? Yes, which is about. For example, if I am a Salafist in the West, in France, for example, in Belgium, is the French secular republic something that you need to obey? It's very complex because you have people that are going to tell you, okay, it's not, of course, an Islamic regime, but they are not. They allow you to pray, to some extent, to have mosques. To wear, for example, scarf. Have you, a few years ago in France, they issued the burqa issue. Is a country that is forbidding, for example, women wearing the burqa, is it still, is my presence as a let's say, fundamentalist Muslim, a Salafi Muslim, is it still something relevant for me in France? That's why we have another issue, which is extremely important when you are, for example, a Salafi in the West today. It has to do with the concept of hijrah, the concept of Islamic migration. Instead of, for example, declaring jihad over the French state, that's what some people do, for example. In France we have the highest number of jihadists going to Syria today. I don't know if Charlie Hebdo, for example, years ago. Of course, the attacks in Paris in November 2015, almost 300 people killed in the streets. So we have a huge, that's why we have also another, there is no country with almost 300 people killed in the streets. But in Europe, at least, you have in the Muslim societies, of course, Iraq, Somalia, and other countries like Pakistan and other countries like that. Let me go back to the issue of hijrah. Should I engage into politics? It is a way of defending my Salafist agenda, or should I leave? Should I go? Sorry, the song. Or should I, for example, as a Muslim who pretends to be a genuine Muslim, should I go, for example, and live in Morocco, and live in Algeria, and live in Qatar, and go and live in Malaysia, because they are not perfect Islamic societies, but at least it's still better than being a Muslim in France, or being a Muslim in the UK or wherever. So this idea of hijrah, it's also, I don't know, I would be happy to discuss this with you. Do you have many American Salafis living in this country in order to go to Egypt, Morocco, the Gulf, or wherever? There is another question. Do I still have a bit of time? A couple of 2 minutes, okay. The role of Salafism in the rise of violence. It's extremely important. This idea of can we observe some porosities or permeability ideologically, politically, sociologically between the whole forms of Salafism and more precisely the jihadist form. It's extremely complicated because if you ask me the question, I will tell you that today we are facing a new trend. We are facing in Europe at least, not only in Europe, but I'm mainly focusing on Europe, a new trend that I would call the autonomization of jihadism. For years, it's true that, for example, in France and other countries, even in the Middle East and in other countries like that, Muslim majority countries, we had this phenomenon of, when you are becoming a violent person, it is to some extent more or less connected to a sort of fundamentalist socialization. You need to have been connected, or you need to have been socialized into a very specific, religious atmosphere, which is no longer the case, actually. Today we have this idea, that's why I use the concept of autonomization of jihadism, and specifically, if you are focusing on the European context, we have many people, and today they are the majority of jihadist fighters, they go and they engage into jihad or jihadism without a previous fundamentalist, socialization. In other words, you don't need to be a Salafist prior to joining, for example, IS or Nusra or whatever. For example, the studies that are currently made, for example, in the European context, they highlight the fact that today jihadism is becoming a school in itself. As jihadism without necessarily Salafism, which means that basically we are facing a new phenomenon. I'm not saying that all the people joining jihadist movements, they pay attention to religion as symbol, they pay attention to Islam as an identity, global identity, but in terms of do they really pay attention to orthodoxy, for example? Do they pray at the right time, at the right place? For example, in terms of sexual contexts and whatever, it's something that is completely new compared, for example, to the previous generations in the 90s, in the 80s, in Afghanistan, in Algeria, in Bosnia, and whatever. I think I'm done, and thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and to discuss with you, of course.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed. Appreciate it. Hassan?
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on this great work. I think it's going to be useful for everyone to read. Over the past, say, 5 years, before that, I've been looking to the issue of Islamic extremism from a historical perspective, a very specific historical point. It's a very modern one. And this is basically when the erosion of Salafism has started, and started becoming rapidly rapidly eroded, specifically since 1979. So I think this is kind of the perspective, the prism I use to explain ISIS. That was from the beginning, from the rise of ISIS, and the point is to see the erosion of Salafism as a problem rather than as kind of as a problem that is producing more and more problems. But the rise of groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda and the erosion of Salafism is kind of almost like a wave that would have to take its course. I don't think anyone can contain that wave. It's a historical wave that will at some point leave some impact. And I think the best governments and activists and individuals and clerics could do would be to shape that wave. Because it could go into something positive, something that, if you're interested in progressive Islam and kind of encouraging that, I think you can benefit from this process that started in 1979, this trend that created things like this Salafi-jihadism or jihadism and so on and so forth after that. So just to explain what I mean by that. So around that time we had a chain of events that started all in 1979, started with the multiple ones. So you had the Iranian Revolution, the rise of revolutionary Shia Islamism, and the capture of one major state in the Middle East. You had also the siege of Mecca with the rise of Messianic hardliners in Saudi Arabia. They captured the Grand Mosque and declared their leader, Jahiman al-Taybi, as their leader and thus like their only legitimate leader. And you had other issues like the invasion of Afghanistan. Obviously that was a major issue that really was whatever was happening in the region in countries like Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, because people focus on Saudi Arabia and it's a major problem as I will focus on, but the things that were happening in Kuwait, small, tiny city, country, or Egypt and elsewhere were also important. In Syria, the jihad, the Islamist uprising at the time. These were all kind of events that created, whatever was happening in this region was implemented and playing out in reality in Afghanistan with the jihad in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So when people like Osama bin Laden or Abdullah Azzam were in Afghanistan fighting, they had an intellectual framework that was evolving and being formulated and formed in the region. And all these events coalesced to create something that is now kind of a full-fledged movement that's producing even more and more movements. And what happens since 1979 with that historical perspective I'm talking about is every time we have unrest in the region, that erosion becomes so fast and so rapid, almost like a river. So there are some points when it becomes so fast and so rapid, and that we saw in 2014 with the rise of ISIS. We saw that before in 2011 with the rise of the kind of the popular movements and the sort of protests in the region that wanted change. In the beginning, people were looking into news on Al Jazeera, on BBC, and elsewhere, and were seeing only the political aspect of it, that people wanted democracy, but they didn't see the other aspect of the Arab Spring, which was also a religious movement that rejected the old ways and wanted to create something new. But people didn't focus on that because that wasn't in the news much. And obviously also became rapid and quick and galvanized after the event of the terror attacks in 9/11, and before that with different events. So every time we have something happen in the region, upheaval, political upheaval, something, this process becomes more obvious to other people. When there's unrest, people forget about it as if it's not happening. So that's why I emphasize this process that what started in 1979, started before, but kind of became, was shaped by the events in 1979, continued and still continues, and will continue, and that wave will have to take its course at some point, and someone will have to try to shape its impact. Otherwise, that erosion of Salafism will continue and create new things. Just like Ahmed said, for example, one of these byproducts of that movement is jihadism. Jihadism is starting to become almost like a full-fledged school of thought that starts to reject the movements that influenced it at some point, whether jihad with a political Islam or Salafism. And a fundamental part of that 1979 transformational moment was the role of political Islam, because people focus on Salafism, they don't focus on political Islam. But it's really a marriage between the two. And it's a perfect, each one played almost a 50% of that role, not just Salafism. Some could argue that Salafism was influenced by political Islam rather than Salafism itself was influenced by something and changed. That Salafism influenced other ones and changed them. It was a change from outside. Obviously, that plays out differently. So I'm talking from the perspective in the Middle East. In America, it might be differently. In Europe, it might be playing differently because some ideas take some time to trickle to other areas. So what happened? I think two intellectuals. If you look at two intellectuals, I think you could explain that. One that was also mentioned by Muhammad, which is Ibn Taymiyyah, who came smack in the middle between all this kind of the early days of Islam and present Islam, 13th century. And he was really the first modern scholar of Islam. Modern in the meaning, in the sense of methodology. He used modern methodologies. He didn't use the traditionalist ways of reaching an opinion, a religious opinion. He used a more modern type of religious judgments and jurisprudence. And the other one is Muhammad Qutb, who died around 4 years ago, who is also an Egyptian. He was based in Saudi Arabia. And I think, obviously there's an army of other intellectuals and other clerics who played a role in this, but I wanted to focus on those because I want to give a concrete example of how this works. So one example is this idea of Hakimiyya, which is, or let's go one step before, this idea of Tawheed. So Ibn Taymiyyah came up with an idea that didn't exist before, which is the idea of having or asking for 3 criteria for someone to abide and comply with this concept of Tawheed, which is monotheism. So in order for you to believe in one God, it's not enough for you just to believe in God. Because he said Arabs before Islam believed in God, but they believed also in a bunch of other things. So he said, in order for you to comply with this idea of monotheism, you have to comply with 3 criteria. The first 2 are important. The first one is to believe in a God, believe in God, and then also to believe only in God. You don't believe in other ones, so you have to be very specific, very, you don't associate, and that's the idea of shirk. You don't associate other deities and other things with the idea of God, with the concept of God. And the third one is more specific about the features of God, what God is and what God is not. It's sort of related to the idea of a creed, Islamic creed. That continued, like I said, Ibn Taymiyyah was right in the middle between old Islam and present Islam, or the beginning of Islam and present Islam. And that idea continued. It was almost mainstream. It was kind of accepted by many scholars throughout history. And then Muhammad Qutb, what he did something very also transformational, in the sense that he imported an idea from his brother, who is better known in the West, Sayyid Qutb, who he was a Muslim Brotherhood person, but he became a more hardline sort of Muslim Brotherhood. He came up with the new ideas that Muslim Brotherhood still read his books and still taught them in their circles, but he was. Many people see him as an outsider, someone who deviated from the ways of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And one of his ideas was the idea that he mentioned, which is the kind of the lawmaker, God as the lawmaker, the hakimiyya, that you cannot, as a Muslim, live under any rule that does not 100% comply with God's rule. It has to be, it has to emanate from something that is prescribed by Sharia, by God, and so on and so forth. That's the idea of hakimiyya, the rulership of God. What Muhammad bin Qutb did was to come to the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah, the three criteria of Tawheed, and he added another one to them that became the fourth one, which is the Hakimiyya, the Tawheed al-Hakimiyya, the monotheism of the rulership of God, meaning, which is in simple terms means, as a Muslim, you have to believe that you have, unless if you don't believe in an idea of the Islamic State, essentially, that you have to live under an Islamic State completely and fully and 100% prescribed by God, then you're not a monotheist. And monotheism is basically the 101 of like the ABC of Islam. Unless you believe in a God that everyone agrees on, everyone agrees that if you don't believe in the Tawheed and the God is one, then you're not a Muslim. So that means now they added another condition, another criterion that complicated the issue for them. So now Tawheed al-Hakimiyya has become almost kind of not specific to his kind of Muhammad Qutb's followers, became more mainstream. So if you ask someone like a mainstream cleric, some of them started to say Tawheed al-Hakimiyya, the monotheism of God as God as a lawmaker, has always been there, and it was just formulated by someone who was only lived over the past 40 years, operated over the past 40 years. So that's kind of the impact of someone like that, and now it's become so mainstream. And all these ideas, when they started to become, and the danger of these ideas is that they speak the language of Salafism, but they're not really, they're not Salafist in the sense that they're not really. It's a new ways, because the genius of new religious movements is when they speak the language, they use the terms almost like a bait and switch tactic. So they use the language of very established concepts, but they interpret them differently. Take, for example, how ISIS uses books like Kitab al-Tawheed, the book of monotheism by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, one of the co-founder of Saudi Arabia. They don't. When you read, when you see their reading list online, you find that book there. But if you go on the ground and you know what's going on in Raqqa, in Mosul, and Deir ez-Zor, and elsewhere, and how ISIS was teaching that book, it wasn't really teaching that book. It was teaching an interpretation of it. So usually they would say, read the Safar Hawali or someone's book on the book of monotheism. So it would be someone else who summarized it or who interpreted it, or so on and so forth, because they know that the person is a perfect proxy for reinterpreting whatever is very close to them, but doesn't really perfectly capture their ideology. So they use it. They sort of use someone else, a disciple, or someone who interpreted that book, but interpreted it in a more different way. And that's why I think it's confusing for some academics to kind of focus on Salafism, because they look at ISIS reading list and they only see books from Salafism, for example, right? And that's why I think Alex's book and Muhammad's comments are very important, because they kind of capture that fusion between Salafism and other ideas, that they're not perfectly like just Salafism. It's a modern a virgin breed of Salafism, and it's important to kind of keep that in mind. One last thing I want to say is how to look at this whole complexity of the different movements. So if you think of if you think of a kind of triangle, so you have traditional Islam on the top corner, and then you have progressive Islam on one corner, and you have Jihadi Islam on one corner. The methodology, the approach is different from all of those things. And I claim that Jihadi Islam has more in common in terms of approach and methodology with liberal and progressive Islam than it does with traditional Islam in terms of methodology and approach. I can give you like so many different examples of that, and one person who actually embodies that sort of methodology, being progressive Islamist, a progressive cleric, and a jihadi, almost a kind of a tool for jihadi at the same time. And for example, if you think of traditionalists, the problem with them is they're very slow at responding to change. So take the idea of photography, for example. The Salafists would reject photography in the beginning, from the outset, because they thought, at some point in the past, because they thought photography is a depiction of a human, and that's rejected by the text. So they look at the text and say it's not acceptable for someone to be depicted, portrayed, or drawn according to the text. And they apply that to photography. They say photography does that, so they reject it. But what happens, they eventually accept the change, accept the argument, but it takes them some time. And they change from rejecting photography into becoming, into taking more selfies than anyone else. They become they accepted it, but they accept it after a while, after like say 10 years or 5 years and so on and so forth. At the same time, they reject progress, but they reject also terrorism and jihadism and so on and so forth, because they think it also violates the textual, kind of the literal interpretation of the text. So take the idea of suicide bombing. All Salafists, without an exception, the true Salafists, would reject the idea of suicide bombing, simply because they say the text says a Muslim cannot commit suicide, because if you commit suicide, you roll in heaven and in hell for eternity. So they say the text says that, so I don't have anything to say. That's what it is. But if you go to an Islamist, they would say suicide bombing is different from committing suicide. That's not because they see another text. They don't rely on another text. They rely on their way, their approach, their methodology of reaching an opinion. So they would say, when you commit suicide, your psyche, your mentality, your mindset is different from someone who is in battle and fighting and then decides to blow himself up. They say the psychology is different. Basically, they say the situation is different. Forget about the text. The situation is different. Whatever the text says, that text is very specific situation. That's what progressives also say about situations. So they say, well, hudud, and the idea of hudud is an old thing because the prison system didn't exist in the past, and we can adapt to this idea. So kind of the contradiction it could be embodied by people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example, is known as someone who is a very progressive Muslim because 99% of his ideas and opinions are actually very modern, very progressive, and so on and so forth. But he allows the idea of suicide bombing. And that kind of captures the triangle I talked about, that his approach is the same, and his approach allowed him to reach that opinion, but the approach of the traditionalists didn't allow them to reach the idea that suicide is okay.
Great. Thank you, Hassan. Before opening to the audience for questions, I want to ask a question to Ahmed, which is the policy question. We try to be policy relevant here as much as we can. And you're someone who's very familiar with the policy conversation about Salafism in the UK in particular, which has been very lively, at least for the last 10 years, if not longer. What is the conversation there, and why have we not seen any conversation like that in the US?
So the report actually starts with the opening chapters are an assessment of how European governments have approached Salafism, how they see it. Generally, the conclusion of that is that often you actually see in France, Germany, you see this word Salafi and terrorists and jihadists used interchangeably. There is little discussion about these divisions that we've just talked about. It's an interchangeable term for an extremist, which also sort of shows you what how they view Salafism. The French state is arguably the most aggressive on the Salafi movement, though the British certainly are pretty close. So in the UK, for quite some time now, there's been a discussion of does Salafi theology and its sort of conservative social values and its rejection of liberal democracy, does that contribute to radicalization? So does that demonization of secular culture make someone turn against their society and seek to fight against it? Or is it this revolutionary ideology of Islamism that's actually doing that? And so you see a lot of focus in the UK on preachers who say things about homosexuals needing to be executed, the conservative views on the role of women, highly sectarian views on other Muslim groups they see as heretical, anti-feminist, all these things. And so they focus on this anti-liberalism as problematic, and they see terrorism as really the tip of the iceberg of what is a very intolerant religious belief system. And actually, I think in the UK as well, they make the mistake sometimes of calling who is really an Islamist Salafi, they just call them Salafis and don't really understand the kind of the complexities, and understandably so in some cases. Today, the kind of Commission on Extremism in the UK, run by a woman called Sarah Khan, has been very vocal in criticizing Salafi groups, Salafi theology, and Islamists. And they believe this rhetoric contributes essentially to radicalization. If you get people to turn against their society, even socially, not politically, you're helping them step towards rebelling against it. And this is the big question: is this question of social cohesion and the attempt by Salafis to isolate Muslims and reject social cohesion, is that actually part of the discussion of counterterrorism, or should these things be seen as two separate issues? And that is a kind of really key discussion, I think, probably as well in France. And the banning of the burqa has to be seen through that frame to some extent, though there's a lot more I know behind it. So yeah, European governments generally are both legally and culturally less constrained about discussing religious activism and religious movements and religion generally than in the U.S., right? So of course the U.S. government, again, constitutionally and culturally doesn't really engage with religion very much. So that partly answers the question of why the government hasn't really engaged with it. And if we also look at the attempts, there have been a couple of forays to have this discussion before, very much through the prism of jihadism, that have been the response to which have been pretty harsh. So the first attempt I can think of in the U.S. to discuss Salafism and jihad was by the New York Police Department, the intelligence division there, run at the time by Mitch Silver ended up running it. At the time he wrote the report, I think he was still an analyst there. He's no longer there, but they wrote a report called Radicalization in the West, and they used a number of different case studies. And mind you, this was under the imprint of the New York Police Department. And they wrote this report, and essentially one of the big conclusions was one of the first steps. They actually had a kind of stage-based linear radicalization, let's say, model, which has its critics for sure. One of the first steps, they said, was an adoption of Salafi theology, Salafism. They saw as the first step. This was seen as really problematic for a number of reasons. One, it was by the New York Police Department. So the idea was this is a document that's going to influence how the police view the threat and who they're going to focus on. Are they going to now focus on conservative Salafis who walk around in the outward expressions of the faith as well, how they dress? Are they going to start seeing conservative Muslims as under suspicion? Are they going to target the mosques and that of Salafis because of this? And in fact, this was seen as unconstitutional in the end. The ACLU sued on the basis that this was essentially an act of religious persecution. And in fact, the New York Police Department had to take this report off of its website as a result. A number of other organizations assisted in this effort. CARE, I believe, was one of the main ones, Council on American Islamic Relations, put a lot of pressure. So today, you cannot access that report on the New York Police Department website. You can still get it. As with everything that we try to take offline, you can usually find it somewhere, if not on the Internet Archive, on Scribd, or a million other places if you do this research online. It's still there, but so people tried to have this discussion, maybe a little bit, I wouldn't say, perhaps they didn't have the nuance that we today have in this study, and that I don't blame them. At the time, it was still an early phase in the kind of Western discussion of radicalization, Salafism. But people saw what happened when they did that. It burned, people's fingers were burned, careers were affected. And so I think that also partly explains. So as well as the idea that the government doesn't engage, any attempts to have this engagement have been met with pretty furious response by groups like the ACLU and by Islamic pressure organizations that don't want to have much of a discussion about where, if at all, religious faith has a role to play. So I think that's probably some of the big reasons. But we break it down a lot more in the report as well.
All right, great. Let me open it to questions. Let's take 3 questions. If we have yes. 1. Yeah, please, sir.
Thank you for these enlightening lectures. I learned a lot from all of you about not only Salafism and political Islam in the US and Europe, but also in other parts of the world. My first question is this. Do you think that the rise of jihadism around the world is simply a response to invasion and occupation by some Western powers in the Middle East? Or is it a response to an identity crisis within the Muslim world? The second question is about interpretation of sacred texts. In almost all religious traditions, when interpretation of sacred texts becomes literal, it is likely to lead to, if not to violence, at least to fundamentalism that is intolerant. Within the Muslim world, do you think that a possibility of opening the exegesis of sacred texts to modern exegetical tools is possible? For instance, historical criticism method, literary criticism, and other methods used by exegetes, for instance, within Christianity.
Thank you. I think it was the second one this side. There's a gentleman there.
Stanley Cover. I'm wondering if we may be looking at this as too specific within Islam. There's a concept of the spirit of the age, philosophical concept. I look around the world, and there's a program on extremism. One of the things that stuns me in the post-Cold War world is this explosion of extremism in other religions, a lot of religions, and I see someone not. Is the Salafi extremism in effect just part of a larger extremism? I mean, look at what's going on in Burma with the Rohingya, the Buddhists. This is, I could go on, but you understand the point. And can we be caught in the weeds and not realize that something much bigger is going on that I know I didn't anticipate it in 1990 when the Cold War ended.
Okay, thank you. Sir, yes.
Ian Wilkie, I'm an independent analyst and attorney. The first, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been an extremely informative panel. The first Salafist I met was in the New York criminal justice system, and he was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, a combat veteran, highly decorated. He had executed his wife at point-blank range with a pistol because he said that she had broken the Quranic rule on adultery, and the punishment was death. So I'm wondering what basket of Salafists, the quietists, or the activists, or the jihadi extremists he would fit in, because he really didn't manifest any extremism until he saw in a private matter a violation of the Quran, which he then decided he needed to take into his own hands. And it reminds me of your point about this other Salafist who wouldn't recognize the criminal justice system. He was just the same. And then, so what do we do about private extremists, one, and then you mentioned also the goals of Salafism, and I'm given to understand that the goals of Salafism include the forced conversion of non-Muslims. And when you have a belief system with something that extreme at its core, isn't it then by nature an extreme enough belief to be tantamount to treason?
Thank you, sir. Let's go on. Alex, can you start? Cover each question? Yeah. Oh, whatever you want.
Very quickly, I mean, this guy who shot his wife, I mean, yes, adultery is punishable by execution, but you don't pass judgment on your own, and you don't necessarily carry out the judgment on your own, I don't believe. So I think he would, even in the case of of Salafi belief would be pretty violating a lot of their core beliefs. The goals of the movement. Forced conversion really depends, again, on which type of Salafi we're talking about. For the quietists, there isn't necessarily a forced element to this. It's about the belief that if you educate society, they will come to the inevitable conclusion that this is the only right way to run humanity and the only way to understand the belief. So they have a pretty idealistic view of how this happens. It's a grassroots process. Jihadists, on the other hand, certainly do have forced conversion methods, and we've seen it with IS, and we've seen it plenty of times with al-Qaeda. So again, it really depends on the types of Salafi we're talking about. On the question of this kind of, is jihadism a response to external factors? I mean, look, this comes down to the question of more generally of how, why terrorism comes about. And usually we don't benefit from single issue explanations for understanding terrorism. We try to understand the combination of things that take place. So, of course, if we look at Islamist ideology, in a sense, it was in a way a response to colonialism in the mid-20th century Middle East, but it had its own goals that went beyond dealing with the colonials. It had also goals of changing society. But it was certainly the momentum that it received from having this underground situation was very helpful. Same with the jihadists. I mean, there were jihadists before the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan. There were jihadists before Bashar al-Assad turned on the Syrian people. It's just that it was harder for them to convince everyone that there was a war against them taking place. I mean, the idea is there's a war on Islam. It's been going on from the time Muhammad started to today. It's not going to end until the end of days, no matter what happens. So they're always going to look for examples of that war on Islam. You mentioned the Charlie Hebdo shootings. I mean, why did they murder cartoonists and satirists? You have to think there's a message and a goal that goes beyond simply responding to external factors. So we have to look at those things as the exploitation of grievances by ideologies to advance themselves. The question of the spirit of the age, you can take it to terrorism, if we say studies, even though a lot of academics don't like this idea, there's a terrorism studies field. David Rappaport's 4 waves of terrorism, just very quickly. His belief is that we're currently in the religious wave. So you mentioned we might be in the weeds a little bit if we're looking only at Islamism and jihadism. We're looking at an age where religion is bouncing back because people are looking for objective truth and not seeing it in secular systems. They're looking for objective morality and they're not finding it in secular systems. They're looking for ways to understand themselves and they're losing their identity. So they're turning back to religion, and as a result, religious movements are taking advantage and exploiting this surge. Of course, we are in the religious wave. We have groups like even Aung Shinrikyo in Japan you can put as a religious terrorist organization that carried out the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo. So arguably, we are looking at a time where the expression of terrorism is mostly through the prism of religion today. Jihadism is probably the biggest example of that right now, but we can see other examples for sure.
So I think so. Personally, I think the religious factor plays a big role, not the main role in these movements. External factors sometimes provide an opportunity more than anything else for existing ideas to flourish and thrive. Because if you look at the Iraq War, for example, the responses to it were not all religious responses. There were nationalists, there were Shia, Sunni, there were different ones, identity politics, and so on and so forth. In my research, I think I found that about the religious factor plays 20 to 30% in even groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda and other things. The cause for them to enter the mode of being religious is only 20%, but that's a sizable, still sizable things. And there are other, circumstances happening around there that enables these ideas to become so central, so core, so powerful. Within these things. Just response to just that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I like your question very much. If you allow me to say that it is a $1 billion question, actually, to some extent.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, where does it originate from? Actually, I'm not sure that you can isolate factors, saying it's 20% about religion, 30% about identity, 40% about politics, because you can never, in my opinion, do not ever trust somebody who's going to tell you, I have the explanation. It's not serious. The thing is, we need to go back to history. And jihadism has to do with several, actually, not branches, but a bunch of several generations. I'll give you an example. In the 80s, we had, according to scholars, generally speaking, we converge, we agree with saying that in the 80s something happened in the so-called Islamic mindset, the global ummah, It's because we had for the very first time a transnational movement of fighters going from A to B, from Algeria to Afghanistan, from France to Afghanistan, from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan, in order to support not a nationalist agenda or nationalistic agenda, but a transnational religious design. That's the first, key, let's say, motive. Okay? But at that time, if we are serious, we never had, for example, the enemy was Russia or the Soviet Union, but we never witnessed any attack of a Russian tourist, for example, in 1,000 francs for summer. Who was the enemy, or who were the enemies? Why today, for example, if we have a war in Syria, we have people stabbing other people, their compatriots in London? What happened? 30 years or 35 years difference. Is it the same version or the same understanding of jihadism? Abdullah Azzam, who he supposedly presented, he's considered to be the real founder of al-Qaeda. By the way, he's a Palestinian refugee, which is very important. Because the main thinkers, or some of the main thinkers, this is directly connected and related to your question, because some of the main jihadi thinkers nowadays are of Palestinian background. Zarqawi, for example, he has let's say, the so-called real founder, not of al-Qaeda, but of IS, in Iraq. He has a Palestinian legacy. Have you ever heard of Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is the main thinker of the jihadist narrative? He is a Palestinian. Abu Qatada al-Falastini, the one who made the junction between jihad in the Levant, jihad in the Middle East, and jihad in North Africa in 90s in Algeria. He has a Palestinian legacy. Even Osama bin Laden, we tend to forget, has a Palestinian legacy, his mother's side. I'm not saying, of course, it's the only factor, but it is connected to a certain kind of invasion at a very precise moment in the Islamic society's history. Okay? So you have to deal with two things. The mindset of the actors, the religious political actors. Is it about because they feel they are oppressed by the society? Is it because they feel oppressed by the regime in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and wherever? Or do they identify with a certain notion, a certain understanding of aggression? You can never isolate. That what we need to do is to, step back and try to have a look at the whole picture. And sometimes to have zoom and ism, okay? So this idea for me is extremely important because jihadism was a response to a sort of crisis of sovereignty within the Islamic societies. Bosnia, Chechnya was also very important. And it's connected to your question, sir, because, for example, it's not necessarily politically correct, but the jihadists, at least in their view, in their mindset, they see their violence as a counter-violence. It's not about we are going to be the one who are going to initiate a certain way of violence. We are defending our imagined community or our fellow, believers in the world, all over the world. Is it true or not? To some extent, that's not the question. That's what the people believe on the ground. That's very important. Iraq, for example, 2003, Chechnya, Bosnia, Kashmir, for example. That's why it's never a good idea to oppose or to let certain religious extremists in one side fighting with each other, because the narratives fuel each other. For example, what happened in September 2000, in the Gujarat Valley in India, for example. What's happening today, for example, in Burma? I've been to Burma, for example, but it's extremely important. And you also from this moment on, you need to add other factors. Can we go to, for example, to Burma today? It's impossible. That's why we don't have, at least so far, a transnational jihadi wave in Burma. We have it in Syria because we allow people to go there. We don't have it in the Gaza Strip because it's impossible to join the Gaza Strip. We used to have it in Chechnya, in Bosnia. So there is a sociology of this idea of global village, but there is also a global jihadi village. So you can never isolate, I'm sorry. It's a matter of different levels that are interacting with each other. 1 minute?
We're going to wrap it up and kick us out.
Sorry?
Just we have the room until well.
Okay, that's okay.
So
it's part of a bigger phenomenon, yes, I agree with you. The question is why jihadism is so successful. That's another question. Maybe because states are failed or are failing in providing, this security, in securing and protecting some populations. That's one of the explanations. And this idea of private extremism. Well, Salafism and jihadism, it is religious understanding, it is a political narrative, but it's also a subculture, sociologically. That's why we have some people, for example, today, they can be, let's say, the idea is very, to some extent, funny. They can be Salafists or jihadists in a very specific momentum. For example, when they feel that they have to be Salafi. I'll give you an example. Do all the Muslims eat halal? It depends, but in a very specific context, they can feel extremely connected to this notion of halal. So you cannot, for example, stick to orthodoxy, but when it comes, for example, to being, let's say, if your wife had the bad idea to cheat on you, well, you can feel it's a religious and moral dilemma. And then the religious resource comes up to you, and you feel compelled, to react a certain religious way. It has to do with subculture or counterculture. And we have it, for example, today in France and in Europe. We have some people, they do not necessarily eat non-halal food, they drink alcohol, but when it comes, for example, to a certain conduct, when it comes to marrying with somebody, when it comes to reacting to the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, when it comes to reacting to the French president's last discourse, now the religious mindset comes up, and overtakes, the traditional sociological features that are the components of the personality. And you have one in a very specific configuration, which is religious, and it is activated when you have a certain very specific context. Am I clear?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. I really want to thank Alex, first of all, for the report. As I cannot stress enough how important it would be to read the whole thing and really understand the nuances of what we try to analyze today. And of course, I want to thank both Mohammed and Hassan for their contribution in shedding light on this. Last, of course, I want to thank the whole team at the program for working on the event. Bennett, who loves to be acknowledged, needs to be acknowledged because he did terrific work on this report, from the editing, the formatting, to a lot of actually substantive work on this. And Mokhtar also needs to be acknowledged for his help on this. So thank you very much again, and I hope you can join me in thanking the panelists for today.